The island of Guadalcanal was not merely a battleground, it was an attrition mill. Every man on the perimeter, American, New Zealander or local Solomon Islander, knew that the fight against the Imperial Japanese army was only one front. The insidious enemy was the jungle itself, the crippling weight of malaria, the relentless soaking rot of the tropical rain, and the slow, steady hemorrhage of casualties from diseases that clawed at our guts. Our vital function, running D2, the Coast Watcher and Scout Network, was to be the eyes and ears of the division. Yet even as my men wasted away, a new, urgent order arrived. Colonel Thomas, the freshly appointed Chief of Staff, was keen, perhaps too keen, to step up the information flowing back to us from my scouts operating outside the perimeter. I was, in a quiet, grim sort of way, glad he attached such importance to our intelligence. But as I looked at the dwindling, fever-ridden ranks, I knew we couldn't afford a single wasted effort. The clock was ticking down to 0, and we were already running on empty. Part 1. The Gorabusu Show, October 7th, 11th. 1. The Hasty Departure. The orders came down with a speed that felt reckless. Get on with the Gorabusu Show as soon as possible. There was no time for proper rest or replenishment. It was a chaotic scramble for stores and ammunition, and I found myself pulling out for Aola in double-quick time on the 7th of October. Major Enright, designated to direct the initial attack, and I had already established our signals, a necessity, as communication would be tenuous. We arranged code words and a rendezvous point for the troops arriving at Aola. With Adams already situated there with the tele-radio, we could contact division headquarters, but I knew that line would be fragile at best. The true blessing came from Thomas himself. If plans had to be changed in the field, I could issue the instructions and inform him afterward. That was a gift of confidence that suited me down to the ground. In this war of inches and minutes, bureaucratic chains of command were simply too slow. Our vessel for this long haul was a standard personnel landing craft, diesel-powered. It was far from the ideal craft for a lengthy sea trip at night through choppy waters, but my anxiety was tempered by the presence of Petty Officer Ray Evans. Evans was fast becoming our own private coxswain, a Coast Guard seaman whose Welsh master mariner father had sailed the globe. Evans was a true seaman, a quiet man of unflappable certainty. It took a lot to worry him. The rest of the party included a tough little crew: Corporal Ralph E. Wimpy, Wendling, a crack shot, and Kentucky Highlander, Corporal Vernon C. Stimple, Private First Class Gerald F. Klinger, Private First Class Warner, Michael the Cook, an essential man, and 2 of our most trusted scouts. 2. A blind voyage. Saying goodbye to Commander Dexter at Cookham, we shoved off just after 5 p.m. We bumped along into the gathering darkness, facing a steady southeast wind and persistent, chilling showers of rain. There was no cover aboard the boat, and within minutes we were all soaked to the skin. The only things we managed to keep dry at great pains were our weapons. Evans and I worked out a distance time reckoning. By 9:30 p.m., when we should have been heading in toward the land, the rain was so torrential that making a landfall was utterly impossible. We pressed on at half speed, peering fruitlessly into the black void. It was a test of nerve, trusting the mathematics of a seasoned sailor over the evidence of our eyes. It wasn't until 12:30 a.m. that a lucky rift in the rain clouds offered a brief, blessed glimpse of a rock near Ra Point. I recognized it. I knew there were no Japanese between Ra and Aola, so we hugged the coast, cautiously moving in. We finally reached the beach safely an hour later. Andrew, Daniel Pill, and the rest of the Aola detachment were waiting on high alert. We wasted no time, swiftly unloading our gear and carting it up to the relative safety of the cadets' house. 3. The unseen threat. The tranquility was short-lived. At 7:30 a.m., an alarm. 3 Japanese had appeared on the far bank of the Aola River. They had almost certainly heard us during the night, despite the storm, and were now trying to discover what had arrived. Panic was contained, but urgency was paramount. Evans and Wendling rushed down to retrieve the guns from the landing craft, which disaster had broached on the beach while the rest of us retired hastily behind the station. Our saving grace was that Adams and the precious tele-radio were well hidden a mile away in the bush. But we waited. We let them look. By 11:30 a.m., the Japanese, having seen nothing that looked outrageous, just a stranded boat and perhaps a few local footprints, were allowed to return to Gorabusu. We had successfully concealed our presence to guarantee the element of surprise. Up at the cadets' house, I had Daniel and Andrew immediately transfer all the latest intelligence from Gorabusu onto detailed sketch maps for the attacking force. Then the district headman, Kwa, arrived. He was dispatched to mobilize all available able-bodied men, to serve as scouts and carriers, and to collect local food supplies for the operation. This indigenous support was priceless. 4. A broken boat and scrimping supplies. Meanwhile, Evans was sweating on the beach, wrestling with the landing craft. This was one of the early Higgins models. It possessed neither a bow ramp nor a proper stern cable. He had nearly dragged it off the sand when the governor broke down entirely. That was that. The boat was going nowhere. Its chance of returning to Lunga was nil. This was a massive liability. If the Japanese chose to walk down the coast and found the boat before we attacked, the game was up. The fat would indeed be in the fire. I duly reported the situation, then forced myself to focus on the job at hand. Apart from the Marines' heavy weapons we expected to arrive, our local firepower was pathetic. We could muster only 14 good rifles. We also had a few captured Japanese weapons which might or might not fire, but they could still be used as makeshift pikes with bayonets. That night, we established an elaborate night watch, most of whom were unarmed save for a club or a captured blade. We then turned in on the rough concrete floor. It was a marvelous treat, though. To know we would not be shelled or bombed even for one night made the hard floor feel like a feather bed. I even found that my tin hat made an excellent, if slightly uncomfortable, pillow. A few false alarms, courtesy of land crabs scuttling over the recumbent figures, caused some heart-stopping moments, but luckily no one was shot. The watch covered all tracks leading into the government station, and as far as we gathered later, the Japanese stayed home. 5. Final preparation and the wait. In the morning, everyone was on edge, what the locals called being on the Kiev. At 8:20 a.m., we sent the signal via Adams that all was prepared, while Wendling took a patrol along the back road to have a final look at the Japanese position. Wimpy, the Kentucky Highlander, was a character. He could shoot straight and walk the hind leg off a donkey, but as he himself put it with a grin, he could not spell worth a damn. With him went Warner, Daniel, Gumu, and Bingiti. Daniel and Gumu were veterans, old hands at this game, and Bingiti had gained his grim experience on Tulagi. After the patrol left, the rest of us sat out in the sun and watched the considerable friendly air activity above with a strange, detached academic interest. There was a temporary relief in knowing we wouldn't be bombed that morning. After Michael's classic repast, a delightful cobbled-together meal of rations and local produce, we got the message. The operation would proceed according to plan. Wimpy returned safely, confirming that all the Japanese appeared to be concentrated in the camp. By 11:00 p.m., the watch was posted, and everyone mustered on the beach, tense, waiting for our Marines to arrive. Just before midnight, we heard the distinct sound of a vessel. Being so early, it might not have been friendly, and the sound carried deceivingly far across the water. I held my breath, wondering if our precious surprise had just dissolved. 6. The price of war. Stafford Falls. At 12:50 a.m. on the 10th of October, a landing craft successfully answered the challenge. At 1:30 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Hill came ashore. He had apparently taken over command from Major Enright at the last minute. The colonel informed us that the Marines in 8 landing craft were being towed by 2 converted tuna fishing boats, now used primarily as supply vessels between Tulagi and Guadalcanal, the Yippies, named after their designation Yard Patrol. They were supposed to land everyone before daylight. Then came the devastating news. The tow lines were not long enough. In the rolling swell, one of the landing crafts had its bow wrenched out near Taivu Point. 15 Marines and 3 Navy crewmen were drowned, a grim early price for the Gorabusu show. The first lot of surviving Marines landed around 8:30 a.m. and were dispersed all around Aola. The second Yippie and its remaining landing craft got in about 12:30 p.m., leaving the enemy in absolutely no doubt as to what was going on. So much for surprise. But our capabilities had multiplied. Instead of our 14 rifles, we now had nearly 500. Not all were for the Gorabusu assault. We needed a defensive screen in case we drew the attention of larger enemy parties farther up the coast. Our plans were quickly hammered out. Colonel Hill departed at 2:50 p.m. to attack the smaller parties farther west toward Ruavatu and Kotoya, and crucially, to cut off any retreat from Gorabusu. With him went Daniel, commanding 8 scouts and 30 carriers to haul the tele-radio and heavy ammunition boxes. The Gorabusu force, a significantly reduced Company C, about 90 men, together with my small D2 party and the other section of scouts, left at midnight. I didn't know it then, but Jerry Copinger, whom Colonel Buckley had sent along specifically to ensure I returned unscathed, was one of the best pistol shots in America. He didn't let the colonel down. The Marines Company commander, Captain Richard T. Stafford, was a tall, well-built young man, absolutely keen as mustard on his first independent action. We had 6 or 7 miles to cover, all in pitch darkness. After the heavy rains, the track was a muddy nightmare, and the deep rainwater ditches dug on either side meant men were constantly disappearing into the blackness. I quickly realized that maneuvering a whole company in the dark was fundamentally different from guiding a patrol of half a dozen men. It was chaos. We stopped, and I made a snap decision. Every man had to put a piece of highly phosphorescent, rotting wood in his belt at the back. He could then see the Marine directly in front of him. It was a barbaric solution, but in the jungle function trumps form. My lads, the scouts, went ahead silently. Though the company behind was generating a terrific, sloppy noise, it was quiet 200 yards forward with the scouts. My heart went out to the mortar plate men. They had to use both hands to carry those heavy plates, slipping and sliding in the deep mud. On the whole, however, we managed well, and there were no alarms. At 5:30 a.m. on the 11th of October, the machine gun platoon peeled off to take the eastern position. 30 minutes later, our support platoon with the mortars broke off into the bed of the Gorabusu River, which was thankfully dry. This was turning into a made-to-order operation. The scouts were already waiting there, ready to direct the detachments to their correct positions. Captain Stafford and I, with the 2 rifle platoons, went right around the flank to the west. We were closer in than I had expected, but the thick cover and a sharp rain shower assisted us. The machine gunners were arranged to give us the signal by opening fire shortly after 6:30 a.m. 8. The agony of waiting. Then came the agonizing delay. Scouts went backward and forward, running messages in the pouring rain, while we lay prone in extended order on our sloping line of departure. I became desperately anxious. Every second was an insult to our plan. I worried that the Japanese would send out a foraging party before we got organized. Due to the slope, our bodies acted as miniature dams, and every few minutes we had to raise ourselves off the mud to let the accumulated water run away. Keeping the rain out of our weapons was another grim challenge. Despite the downpour, I could feel the clammy sweat beneath my sodden clothes. Apart from the butterflies, the cold, clammy butterflies in my stomach, the coldness of the rain was starting to give me the gripes. I feverishly thought over every minute detail we had planned. The operation absolutely must not fail. It was fully light now. Even if the Japanese didn't go foraging, might they just wander out to see what the weather was like if the rain stopped? Would those guns never open fire? Would our weapons work after hours in the rain? At last, at 8:30 a.m., after what genuinely felt like a million years, the machine gunners opened up. We slithered into action. When the Japanese returned fire, we took cover behind some felled coconut logs. Their fire was thin, and after a short exchange, we thought resistance was sufficiently reduced to make a run-in. We should have waited longer. Captain Stafford, keen to seize the moment, put his head up above his coconut log for a look-see and took a bullet straight between the eyes. He was annihilated instantly. I was right next to him. This was not the time to falter. I instantly sprang forward, scrambling over the log, and the rest followed. After a short, savage hand-to-hand struggle, during which I had a narrow shave with an enemy sword, the remaining Japanese fled straight into the arms of the machine gunners. Part 2. The Cost of Victory and the Desecration. 9. The Unsolved Mystery. From the scouts attached to the machine gun platoon, I learned that about 15 Japanese had, exactly as I had feared, left the area at dawn. The machine gunners had narrowly missed bumping into them, and they had left a scout to shadow them, to avoid alerting the main party, a brilliant tactical decision that unfortunately delayed the attack. We annihilated 27 Japanese in the bivouac area. Some hadn't even made it out of bed. But no one could identify Ishimoto, the elusive intelligence officer we were after. Some of the enemy were 6 feet tall and all wore naval badges. A guard in a large nut tree was brought down just in time when someone happened to look up before he could open fire. 2 sentries on the beach, whom we missed, were caught by the scouts later. My lads combed the area for any skulking stragglers, while one platoon took up defensive positions to cover our withdrawal to the shore. The D2 party and I sorted through the much valuable Japanese equipment, radio gear, and, most crucially, marked charts clearly illustrating points on the route of the Tokyo Express. 10. The Priest's Chalice and the Final Insult. I had fairly definite evidence before leaving Lunga that the Catholic missionaries from Rueratu had been murdered, but no trace of them had yet been found. We knew the men we had just attacked had previously taken them into custody. It was rumored that after the Tenaru battle, the Japanese wanted to use one priest to urge the Americans to surrender. When the missionaries declined, they were ordered released. However, in late August, the Japanese returned to Rueratu and arrested them again. Taken to Tasimoko for questioning, they were accused of sending military intelligence to the Americans. They remained under guard in a small native hut until about the 3rd of September, when all were brutally murdered. Only poor old Sister Edme, suffering from elephantiasis and malarial fever, had been left at Rueratu and escaped into the bush with the orphan girl in her care. Among the Japanese equipment, we found the chalice and most of the altar cloths and vestments of the mission. The chalice had been used as an ashtray. One of the altar cloths, a beautiful embroidered piece, had been wrapped around one of the Japanese soldiers still in bed, used as a blanket. It had given him no protection. My stomach revolted at the sight of him. As at the Tenaru, the sight of the sprawling, inanimate cadavers appalled me. Here I had taken an even more active part, yet I still couldn't choke off my imagination. Why? Why? If there but for the grace of God. I quickly turned away and busied myself with logging equipment. My lads, who had done splendidly, were exultant. Lena even got back the machine gun he had carried for the Japanese all the way from Moro. The Solomon Islanders didn't seem to suffer from morbid thoughts like mine. In the small wars of their ancestors, success meant the total elimination of the enemy. Once the battle was over, there was nothing more to fear. They were all desperately short of clothing. Most of them had parked their lava-lavas, haversacks and valuables along the track, going into action naked except for their ammunition belts. As soon as the action ended, they retrieved their belongings and were soon properly dressed, often in captured Japanese blackout cloth, which was the latest dash. 11. Hill's Success and the Victory Feast. Having seen the Marines and Captain Stafford's body safely embarked, I took the remaining landing craft, firmly requisitioned by Ray Evans, and went up the coast to meet Colonel Hill. He had found only one large party, which he surprised completely, annihilating 3 but losing one of his own men with 1 wounded. The rest of the enemy had plunged off the track into a bottomless swamp from which the locals swore there was no exit. Hill had wisely left them there to prove it. Large dumps of stores were discovered, as well as several 3-inch anti-aircraft guns complete with ammunition. These would have played havoc with our transport planes had they been brought into action. What truly pleased Daniel, whose mind was a quartermaster's dream, was 2,100 bags of Japanese rice. He arranged to send it down to Aola to give the islanders a victory feast. Colonel Hill ordered the evacuation of the area and a return to Aola. We had a fairly accurate tab on the stray Japanese, and scouts were left behind to eliminate them as opportunity offered. 12. The air battle and the drowning pilot. Setting off back to Aola, we immediately found ourselves under the middle of a fierce air battle. Some 20 Bettys, Japanese bombers, chased away from Lunga, were being pounced on by Air Cobra fighters overhead. They jettisoned their bombs in the sea right in front of us. Evans performed miracles with our landing craft, as we all did our best to shrink into the bottom of the boat. Luckily, all we got was the resulting spray. The air above became an absolute melee, and bullets and empty cartridge cases rained down all around us. Then planes started to crash into the sea. One of our own came down in a terminal dive at terrific speed. The pilot cleared his plane a bare 100 feet from the sea, hitting the water so hard that all his clothes were ripped off. We picked him up, but he died 10 minutes afterward. Another pilot we rescued had gashed his eye very badly. In fact, it was hanging out. But when we got to Aola, Tyranny, a good doctor, stuck it back in and covered it with gauze and plaster. The flyer was a lucky chap. He was back in action a month later. We also picked up another of our own pilots and one Japanese pilot, both in poor condition. I was quite relieved to get back to Aola. We were all washed out, but it felt safer somehow. Part 3. The Shocks of Lunga, October 13th, 16th. 13. A moment of reprieve. A message came from D2 via Adams that Colonel Hill's men could stay on at Aola for a day or so if I thought it necessary. It also intimated that Lunga was under a solid attack from the west, and they wanted no nonsense from the east. The colonel agreed to wait until the next day and give his men a well-earned rest. All was quiet that night, but we kept a 2-hour watch just in case. In the morning, Daniel took a patrol back to Gorabusu to see whether the remaining Japanese had turned up. There was no sign of them, but more charts and some interesting notebooks we had overlooked were brought back. Colonel Hill's transport turned up just after noon. It consisted of only one of the Yippie boats. The other had broken down. After a lot of frenzied radio messages, Division Headquarters accepted my suggestion that one company walk back along the coast to Tenaru and clear our eastern wing. The company was quite pleased. The colonel was not, but he left one landing craft personnel to get those of us from D2, Buckley's crystal ball outfit, back home. I doubt Ray Evans would have let him take it with him anyway. 14. Michael's classic repast. That evening, with a company of Marines to guard us, we had what might be described as almost a party at the cadets' house. There was nothing to drink, but we all gathered around the old wood stove in the kitchen while Michael produced a meal to end all meals. He hadn't had much to work on, but one of the star numbers was pawpaw, hollowed out, stuffed with sea-ration hash and beans, and baked in the oven. To go with this, we had some panna, small cigar-shaped yams that, when broiled on top of the stove, tasted like floury potatoes. A pigeon or two appeared from somewhere, and Michael produced a marvelous fruit pie, all cooked in a couple of ordinary mess tins baked in the oven.